here? Good morning. I am Dr. Rebecca Resnik. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. Really appreciate it, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Honored to be part of Cecily's Advocacy Day again. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I have practice with 10 clinicians. I have a practice in Bethesda and Rockville where we do neuropsych testing, educational consulting, therapy, group therapy, all of these good things. Basically what we do is we help families during times when they're worried about their kids. I think people are going to still trickle in just a little bit. In terms of thinking about why I've titled this The Foundation of Success, now I'll be honest with you just a little bit, because if you put something in your title about how what you're going to talk about is like the key to success, parents come. But I'm really very serious about executive functioning as being the foundation of success. And by success, I mean achieving goals and working up to your potential. Not just getting to Harvard, although, you know, hey, that would be nice. And what I'm going to talk about today is a lot of affective neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. These fields are now coalescing in a new discipline called mind, brain, and education, which I find very exciting because you have a lot of people from different fields coming together and putting research together in a way that can actually inform teaching instead of just staying in labs. So I'm very serious when I say these are the foundations of success. Why? Because the research tells us so. The research tells us that it is not enough to be smart. We had, back in the olden days, the idea that there were the smart kids, the rabbits, and there were the slow kids, the turtles. And that everybody came to this world as either one of the smart kids or one of the slow kids. And what we found is that just plain old intelligence or talent, these are no longer the most predictive factors for who achieves their goals and achieves up to their potential. Now we're starting to understand that things like mindset and grit help us understand who's going to be successful and who's not to a greater extent than just who is smart. So yes, I wanted you to come, and that's why I made this title, but I'm also very serious as to why this is such an important topic for educators and parents and psychologists to pay attention to. There are 3 parts to this talk. The first part, we're going to go through a little bit about how the brain works. As I've given more and more of these talks over time, I've learned to take away pictures of brains. I've learned to take away a lot of text and just sort of talk about ideas. Einstein said that if you can't explain something in simple terms, you really don't understand it very well. So even though we're going to joke a lot and there will be pictures from movies, if you know the movie, you can call it out. Anybody so far? Okay. I'm going to engage your seeking system. We'll talk about what that is by putting up these various recognizable affect-laden pictures. This helps you with retention better than putting up words and charts. So part 1 is brain basics. Part 2, we'll talk about what the executive functions actually are. And the third part is the part that is why you came today. You didn't come to hear me talk about brains, probably. The third part is where we actually talk about what does this mean for our kids and how can we do better at teaching, learning, and serving students. Okay, so the brain is a very expensive organ. It takes up about 2% of your body mass and uses about 20% of all of your energy reserves. Why on earth would nature make something that's that costly to create and maintain? Well, the reason why we all have such fantastic brains is because our ancestors who didn't, they're not here with us today. Every one of us in this room is the product of carefully crafted natural selection or intelligent design, or however you want to think about it. But the fact is we have a fantastic brain that can do a lot of things, so it was worth it over time for our ancestors to use 20% of their caloric resources to creating and maintaining this brain. Now, just like anything else that's expensive, you don't want to use a lot of it, and you don't want to use it as much, you want to use it as little as you possibly can get away with. So one part of what we're talking about with executive functions is efficiency, using the least amount of energy possible to get the most done. We'll talk a little bit about neuroplasticity, and that means that the brain is literally constructing itself in response to the environment. We all need different types of stimulation as we go through our lives. Babies who don't get the right kind of stimulation, being held, rocked, cuddled, they literally will die or have severe brain damage. Nature designed our brain to come with some things hardwired, but most of what we learn to do and most of what we achieve and who we become is what we call soft-wired. It happens as a result of the things that happen to us. We used to think neuroplasticity, this changing and flexibility, was something that only happened in little children. More recent research has shown us that neuroplasticity continues for your whole life. Those of us who are of a certain age, we just have to work a little bit harder to get our brains to learn new things, but we can constantly change our brains and develop new capacities and get better at things for our entire life. And neuroplasticity is a double-edged sword. The day we stop trying to push ourselves and get better and learn, the day we sit back on the couch and eat junk food and watch TV all day, that's when we start to lose brain function. So our brain has some things it has to do to keep us alive, and these are the basic goal-oriented behaviors that we have. Call them the 4 F's. So we have fleeing, feeding, fighting, and finding true love. These are the things we're hardwired to have to do. But we know that human beings do a lot more than that. We write poetry, we do science experiments. Some of us are even crazy enough to pursue a doctoral degree in psychology, which is like one of the worst financial decisions you can possibly undertake. Because you earn less than somebody with a master's degree who can do the same thing. Why do you do this kind of thing? Because we're curious, we're seekers, we're problem solvers. Fantastic thing about our brain in terms of how we differ from animals, we're capable of a lot of kinds of reasoning that no other animal is capable of. And because I like dogs, I'm going to pick on dogs. If you want a dog to go in a crate, your dog doesn't want to go in the crate, right? So what do? You take a little bit of food, you throw it in the crate, and all of a sudden your dog is so happy. They run right into the crate, they eat the treat, and then they turn around and, oh, I'm in the crate. Well, look at that. Try that with a toddler. It's not going to, no, that's not going to, you might get that to work once or twice, but a toddler is going to be able to do something called prospection, if-then thinking. Your toddler is going to say to itself, if I go into that box to try to get the treat, she's going to slam the door on me. A dog will go into that crate every day of its life until it dies, because its brain doesn't have the capacity for predictive modeling, prospection, and all those things we're going to talk about. As our brain develops, the goal of your brain, like I said, it's expensive. Your brain doesn't want to use any more resources than it absolutely has to. So what do we want to do is we want to get efficient. All through childhood, your brain is stuffing itself full of information, right? We have this protracted childhood so that we can learn all of the things we need to learn. Nowadays, we think of people as being kids until they're like 21 years old. Baby rabbits are fully capable of surviving alone at like 2 weeks. Why would nature design us to have this long learning period? Because we don't come hardwired with all of our survival skills. And this is why we spend so much on private school, right? Because we need our kids to learn all of these things so that they can get along in society. And every year the stakes get higher. Back in the day, back in my grandfather's time, you could become a corporate executive with a high school diploma. Anybody think that's happening for our kids? So when they call us helicopter parents, we've got good reason to be helicopter parents because we have no idea what kinds of things our kids are going to have to do in the next 20, 30, 50 years. And we're all going to live to 150 now, so it's even worse. But we're all about developing efficiency. And what nature's designed our brains to do is we go through this period of middle childhood where we stuff them full of knowledge, right? Kids do Cub Scouts, they build forts, they play video games, they learn violin. And then all of a sudden at adolescence, the brain starts cutting everything back. It goes through this aggressive pruning process, just like you'd take a hedge and cut the heck out of it. Why would we do that? Why would we stuff a brain full of all this great knowledge only to chop it all away? Well, because what happens in adolescence is we get leaner and meaner and more efficient. We get to the point where instead of being able to read James and the Giant Peach, we can read Neruda or Borges, or we can read The Grapes of Wrath, or we can read Shakespeare. We get to the point where we need our brain to function better and more efficiently so that we can do the kind of abstract reasoning that's so essential to success in the adult social construct. Important thing to remember here is that you can have a kid who's like 18 years old and looks like they could already be a father of 5, and they may have the executive functioning of like a 12-year-old. You can conversely have a kid who's like this little pipsqueak type of kid, the way my stepson was. You know, by the time he was 14, he still looked like an 11-year-old, but his executive functioning was very well developed. As teachers and parents, we often look at somebody and say, this looks like an 18-year-old, I expect this person to be able to do what your typical 18-year-old who looks like this can do, and we're often wrong. So this part of your brain, the outer layer, you have all around your brain, you have this 6-cell thick outside kind of blanket. We call it the cortex. And if you were to iron it out, it would be about like the size of a pizza. And this very thin layer of brain is what makes us who we are. Your self, your thoughts and feelings, the way you make sense of the world, a lot of the action is happening in this outer layer. Your prefrontal cortex is getting stuff done. Dr. Elkanon Goldberg, neuropsychologist, likens it to a CEO of a company. And a CEO of a company can't pay attention to everything, right? Those of you who own businesses or schools, you know that you can't pay attention to every single little detail. Bill Gates can't function if he's constantly thinking about, gosh, I wonder if the trash cans in the employee lounge have been emptied today. He can't do that. What has to happen is that the brain has to have a way of figuring out what's most important to pay attention to and what do you actually need to accomplish a goal at any given time. There's no little person sitting up there. There's no conductor of the orchestra. What we basically have is the cortex is constantly getting barraged by information from all parts of the brain, and somehow we manage to figure out what's most important to pay attention to so that we can get stuff done, so that we can accomplish the 4 F's and then write poetry. When I talk about the field mind, brain, and education, part of why I think that's so important is because we had this idea in Western culture that what's most important is rational thought. And we want to divorce our thought from emotion, right? Emotion is for women and children and people with dark skin. You know, ideally in Western thought, the idea is that the white Christian male could be the one to have perfectly rational thought and not be confused and sullied by all of these emotions. And we know that's not true. Our brains create an illusion for us that we're rational people. We're not. Every bit of thinking that we do is always emotional. There could never have evolved a being like Mr. Spock, who is completely emotional, and even he, ran into his times where he and Kirk had to fight. That was going to happen. Everything we do is an emotionally based decision. Every piece of information that you've remembered in your brain is tagged with some kind of emotional tag. So there's almost nothing that's neutral. You can think back in your mind, and I'm not going to ask anybody to say anything, but you can think back in your mind to a time when you were in school when you had a miserable time, or maybe someone said something that humiliated you, or you got a bad grade. We can access all of these very easily. And for our kids who are struggling, a lot of their experiences as they progress through education have negative tags attached to them. For me, when I think back to reading was wonderful. I got to be the superstar kid for whom it came very easily. But then when it was time to play basketball, I was the one who was an embarrassment and no one would pick me for their team. So you may have a very different tag in your mind. You may remember reading as that time of day that you most dreaded, but basketball was finally the time of day when you could do something wonderful and have a great time. For me, it was torture. Okay. Thank you for holding on for part 1. We're getting to the application phase, I promise. Now let's talk more about what the executive functions actually are. This is like a hot topic now. I've presented on executive functions, I think 4 times over the past 2 months. People are starting to get the idea of what it is and why it matters. And as you think about the executive functions, think about getting stuff done with maximum efficiency. That's what it's all about. There are different schools of thought about executive functions, and some people will argue that there are many, many executive functions, and you can split it down to many, many subcategories, guys like McCloskey. And then you have other guys like Naglieri, who is a researcher. You may have seen him present around. He does a lot of talks. Naglieri argues, no, executive functioning is actually a unitary function. Who cares? What we want to talk about today are some concepts that matter to our kids. And so I've sort of condensed these down into some bite-sized ways of thinking about it so that you won't start pulling out your iPhones. Even though all of this really is emotionally based, we can sort of lump these things into two categories. The ones that we consider kind of the cool executive functions and the ones that we consider like the hot executive functions. The cool executive functions, these are the things we tend to associate with cognitive tasks, the things that we associate with getting schoolwork done, getting your homework done, remembering to bring your lacrosse stick to school, organizing your binder. Sorry, I see. This room is not so great for seeing. And self-monitoring. So as you look through your worksheet, do you go back and check the spelling? Almost nobody does. But these are the kind of cognitive executive functions. And again, we have a lot of very smart kids in our classes who don't perform particularly well because these are their areas of weakness. Now in my practice, I see a lot of kids who are being counseled out of schools. And counsel out is kind of a nice term for when the parents come in as the board head of McLean School alluded to, for that terrible meeting. This happened to my family when my brother was little. You have that terrible meeting where what you hear is your child is no longer welcome at our school. And that's just about one of the worst days of your life. Short of cancer, of course, but that's a bad one. A lot of the kids I see are perfectly bright, and they don't have particular problems with their processing speed and such, but a lot of them are really struggling with this emotional and behavioral self-regulation. So we have kids who are having meltdowns. We have kids who are disruptive. We have kids who are exhibiting even aggressive behavior at school. And a lot of times we do call these kids the bad kids. Well, that's not actually what's going on. We'll talk a little bit about that. Just as, first presenter, I'm blanking on her name, Dr. All right, just as she alluded to, these are generally not things that are really within a child's voluntary control. Okay, our attention system was designed to pay attention to exciting things. Now, don't you feel like you got your money's worth? Look at that. That's a revelation, right? People don't pay attention to boring things. I'm quoting researcher Dr. John Medina, who wrote this wonderful book called Brain Rules. If you ever get a chance to read it, and you're nerdy enough to want to, it's a very good read. So people don't pay attention to boring things. What do we pay attention to? We pay attention to things that could eat us, things that we could eat, things that might have sex with us, and things that we could have sex with. I think that there's no better, it's true. I want you to think of the St. Pauli Girl beer logo, right? It's this woman with a huge bosom and she's holding beer right by her chest. This is the most brilliant logo ever created. We don't pay attention to boring stuff. What do our kids spend most of their day doing? Boring stuff, right? Worksheets. I work with a lot of kids from private schools, but not McLean, of course, which is fantastic, but there's a lot of private schools around where people are paying $35,000 a year per kid for their kids to be doing worksheets. What the heck is that? You know, I want the kid learning on like a jungle gym and taking field trips to the moon for $35,000. I want McLean school level of goodness. So in terms of we don't pay attention to boring things, we actually pay attention to very little. Our attention system works more like a spotlight. It is low bandwidth. Anyone else remember back in the early days of the internet how we had modems and you tried to bring up a web page and you waited for like a minute for the web page to load? Our attention system has low bandwidth. We're not like a super fast internet system. But here's the great thing. We think we are. Our brain creates for us the illusion that we're taking in a lot more information and paying attention to a lot more things than we actually are. We're not. Most of what we're experiencing is our brain making a statistical prediction about what's likely to be there and filling in the gaps. as I look at it, all of you people, I think that I'm looking at this nice group of people and I'm trying to monitor, okay, is anybody looking bored? Anybody looking mad? Anybody, going to jump up and start strangling me? No, okay, that's good. She said she'd take a bullet for me, so we're good there. But actually, what I'm paying attention to very little, and even more so because I'm talking at the same time. So I'm missing a lot of what's happening. But my experience is that I'm perceiving everything that's going on in this room. So again, attention's like bandwidth. This is relevant to our kids when they tell us that they can multitask. And of course, we adults, we're just as bad. We drive down the road and we're, messing with the GPS and we're sipping our Starbucks and maybe we're yelling at the kids and, maybe it's, I dropped my water bottle, can you get it? So you're there on 495, holding the steering wheel and trying to get this water bottle up off the floor. Get good at that when you're a parent. But we actually have very little attention to devote to a lot of things. And so even though we have the illusion that we multitask well, we don't. So the next time your teenager says they want to have their phone text system on and they want to listen to music and they want to be doing their homework and they want to do all that, you can tell them that this evil psychologist that you saw said that they can't. Most of the problems that people have with their attention is not that they can't pay attention. Everybody can pay attention to the right thing. What do our kids find it very easy to pay attention to? Yes, right? Nobody has a problem paying attention to video games except me. What we need to think about with attention is how well can we exert voluntary control over our attention. You all are doing it right now. You could be thinking about something much more exciting than me. You could be thinking about the St. Pauli Girl logo. That's more exciting. But you're deciding, no, I'm not going to think about something more fun and interesting. I'm going to pay attention here, probably because you have a kid that you're concerned about and you want to do right by that kid. So your brain is making a decision to override something fun in service of something you think is more salient, that will help you achieve whatever goal it is you wanted to achieve in coming today. I do a lot of consulting with STEM scientists, with computational linguists, and these are like super high power nerds. I love working with them. Attention is not just about being distracted and not being able to pay attention. Attention problems can also be about getting stuck. You heard our first presenter talk about trouble shifting attention. This is volitional control, right? Can you shift your attention from one thing and put it on another thing? A lot of kids struggle with what we call hyperfocus. And you know this because if your kids have a gaming system, like me, if you were foolish enough to bring one of those things into your house, your kid is there completely sucked into this gaming system and the house could be burning down around them. And it would be just 1 second, just 1 second, just 1 second. Scientists actually find this hyperfocus to be an essential part of what they need to do. It's called a state of flow. Are you a scientist? Or is that why you're nodding and smiling? Or no? Okay. For my husband, he's a computer scientist and he does a lot of programming. He has to be able to have his attention completely sucked into programming for hours at a time. Otherwise, you can't do it. I can't do it. My attention doesn't hyperfocus that way. So hyperfocus can be a real liability when you're a little kid, but later on in life, it can become the thing that lets you become a super successful scientist. Now let's play a little game. I'm going to ask you to control your attention. I'd like everybody right now to pay attention to your toes. And if you're not wearing high heels like I am, you probably weren't paying attention to your toes before now, but now you are, right? Okay, got your attention paying to your toes. Now I want you to direct your attention inwardly and ask yourself if you're hungry. Ask your stomach. You can do this, right? You can direct your attention and say, oh, okay, my stomach, not growling, probably ate too many pastries. No, I'm not hungry, I'm fine. Now I'm going to ask you to take your attention and focus it on your mood. How are you feeling today? Frustrated, happy, bored, like this is the best talk ever? You can now shift your attention to your mental state. Now I'm going to ask you to time travel. I want you to go back to yesterday and remember what you ate for breakfast. Pretty easy, right? If I asked you what you ate 6 weeks ago, you probably couldn't come up with it. But you can pretty much remember what you ate for breakfast. Now let's go into the future. Time travel to tonight. What are you going to eat for dinner tonight? Probably. Do you have plans tonight? Do you have a babysitter tonight? Is this your night to Netflix and chill? Isn't that amazing that for all of us with our mature brains, we could take our attention from our toes to interoceptive attention, paying attention to our body system is working, pay attention to our mood, and time travel. No other organism can do that. We can do that because we've got mature brains. Our kids often can't do that. But the cool thing is we can teach them to do that. Now we're talking about working memory. This is Julia Childs, and I think this picture best captures what working memory really is. So here's Julia, here's the part we see, right? If you're my age, this is what you grew up watching on Sunday afternoons. And here's all her little minions down underneath making her look awesome. Why this picture? Because working memory is all about pulling up the right information that you need to get a task done. We often think of working memory as being like holding on to a string of digits. You remember when you used to have to call directory assistants and get a phone number, and then you were like, 555-1212, 555-1212, 555-1212. And if somebody asked you a question, you lost it and you had to call back. Working memory is really not just about holding on to little bits of information. It's really about using the information that you need to get a task done. Now today, what you're seeing is me pulling up working memory information about brain science and what I want to say, and thinking about different studies that I've read in different books. Be very grateful that I didn't come here and start activating the working memory tracks for taking a shower. That would have been bad, right? I'm not doing the ones that involve what you do when you gut and clean a fish. Again, be happy about that. The amazing thing is that for adults, our brains pull up the right script, the right amount of information we need to get a task done, and we almost never even have to think about it anymore. Those of us who are over 40, we've been doing this stuff for so long, we rarely even have to think about a lot of the things that we do professionally and to get through our day. But our kids are still finding this piece a struggle. Memory's not just a nice feature of our brains. Memory is not about the past, it's about predicting the future. Every memory that we have has an emotional tag to it. The reason we have memory is, the reason it's an advantage to us is because memory allows our brain to make a statistical prediction about what's going to happen next. When you came here today, you had a pretty good assumption that you were going to come, it might be hard to park, you were going to eat some breakfast, hopefully be sitting next to somebody interesting to talk to instead of getting stuck with somebody boring, you were going to come to some talks. You know, you didn't come and expect me to be swinging off a pole, right? You didn't expect to come here and have open bar. You had a pretty good understanding of what today was going to be like. For our kids, they don't often, and particularly kids on the autism spectrum have a very difficult time with this prospective modeling, thinking through what's likely to happen. And for kids on the spectrum, they often have serious anxiety around transitions. In particular, well, why? If you don't know what's coming next, you tend to get very anxious. For most of us, we know, mildly boring talks, fun talks, nice talking to people, we go home and hang out. So with prediction, we use our old knowledge to make new knowledge. And anybody recognize what that is? The Batmobile, right? Sorry for you people in the back. It's the Batmobile. Does that really look anything like the Batmobile? No, it's a blueprint. But our brains are so good at taking a little bit of background knowledge and using it to make a prediction about what something could be that most of the people in this room probably recognize the Batmobile really quickly. Pattern recognition is one of the things that our brains do to get through making things more efficient. We are, at heart, pattern recognizers. When you go into the doctor, your doctor has been trained through many years of repetition to be a pattern recognizer. So your doctor can tell immediately if you're more likely to have strep throat or gonorrhea. This is not that hard. Your psychologist is doing the same thing when you bring your kid in. What does this look like? Does it maybe look more like an autism spectrum disorder? Could this be an executive functioning disorder? Who recognizes this pattern? Anyone? Yes? Reservoir Dogs! I was hoping there was at least one Tarantino geek in the room. Did anybody recognize it better after he said that? No, I'm the only one who likes Reservoir Dogs. I'm a bad person, obviously, because Reservoir Dogs is very violent. When we look at this, this really isn't a picture of people in any significant way. I mean, it's a little bit of unconnected information. You've got basically a bunch of blobs, but everybody who looked at it was immediately able to use the perceptual principle of good continuation to make these into people in your mind. Even though when you just look at it, it really doesn't look a lot like people. We're very, very good at making patterns, which is part of why conspiracy theories are so enticing. And as we develop, especially through the teenage years, we get good at thinking strategically. We develop the capacity for what's called metacognition, which is being able to step back and think about how you're going to do something. Your first step is you want to recognize the pattern, and then after a while, you get to the point where that pattern triggers from working memory, up comes a nice strategy. Your frontal lobe decides, is this a good strategy? Is this a bad strategy? You move forward and you evaluate how well you're doing. This is Sammy, a little chess prodigy from the last century, playing all of the current chess masters of the entire world at the same time. That's pretty cool. And again, the important thing about how our brains mature is that what we are after is decreasing effort, is for the brain to use less and less energy to get things done over time. This is an image from Dr. Elkanon Goldberg, and he was one of the first to come up with a theory for how left versus right hemispheres of our brain work. Now, this idea that we all grew up with, that like, oh, you have one hemisphere that's the creative side, and one hemisphere is the rational side, that's just never been supported by science. But what we know about left versus right hemisphere is actually way more cool than that. Right hemisphere of the mammalian brain, the cortex on that side is actually thicker, because this is the part of our brain where we solve novel problems. When new stuff comes up, let's say you go out to your car today and somebody's put a cougar inside, just like in that movie Talladega Nights, you got a novel problem to solve because you weren't expecting that. That was not part of your predictive modeling. And so your right hemisphere is going to become really active, right? So the right hemisphere, again, dealing with novelty. Once something gets to the point for us that it becomes automatic and it becomes routine, the left hemisphere of our brain takes over. Why does this matter? Because this is what we're doing with our kids in school. It is so critical for our kids to develop automaticity with a lot of things. This is why we do basic math fact memorization. This is why they memorize spelling words, sight words, heuristics for solving math problems. We need our kids to get completely automatic. Why? Because once something's automatic, it takes less energy, less effort, right? You can drive and do probably 5 different things at once and not crash your car. Because we do this, right? Because it's become automatic. Could a 16-year-old do that? No, and how do we know this? Because 16-year-olds crash their cars. Teenagers die in car accidents all the time, less so for those of us over 40 who've gotten really good at it. So talk a little bit about the hot EFs. And again, these emotion-based executive functionings are often the things that are really make or break for our kids, but for adults too. If you know an adult who's particularly, capable and talented, but everywhere they go, their behavior is off-putting, or they don't get their work done on time, or they let you down when you're working as a team, these people are not successful in their work. The only reason we do anything is because of emotion. Emotion will drive us to work very, very hard. Now, when I was teaching, I taught special ed, God help me, which is just about the hardest job short of parenting an infant that you can have. For those of you who are teachers, you have like the hardest job that I've ever done. And one of the things I often heard, and I still hear it today when I'm doing neuropsych testing, is that there are kids who are lazy and unmotivated. The presenter this morning talked about this too, right? I've never met a kid who wasn't motivated. And I'll give you an example. I once worked with a little guy. He was 12 years old, and he was very bright. And he was doing absolutely nothing in school. He would show up, but he wouldn't do any work. And you might say that he was unmotivated, but he was tremendously motivated. He would stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning working. And guess what his little business was? He was downloading porn and putting it on CDs and selling it at lunch. Yeah, that takes some creativity, some self-discipline, and entrepreneurial spirit. This was a motivated child, right? So when we say to ourselves that our kids aren't motivated, it's not that they're not motivated, it's that we haven't found something that's going to trigger their motivation. They're motivated to play video games, right? They're motivated to watch TV and YouTube videos. How we think about things shapes our perceptions. Who sees a skull? Who sees a beautiful lady? Okay, about half and half. That's pretty typical. What's happening is that your brain right now is actually toggling back and forth between skull, beautiful lady, as your brain tries to solve the problem of what is it I'm actually looking at. Remember, our perceptions are not very accurate. What we perceive has a lot more to do with who we are and how we see the world and the information actually coming into our brain. And this is important for our kids, right? Is the school day horrible? Is homework time a nightmare? Are they dreading going into the locker room because they know they're going to get bullied? Are they can't wait for its academic practice because they're a total dork and that's the one time of day when they feel good about themselves? So we have to pay attention to how our kids feel. Now, does this mean we have to keep them happy all the time? No, of course not. But we've ignored for too long the role of how our kids experience what we're doing in school. You have deep in your brain two little almond-shaped structures called the amygdala. And everybody's heard about the amygdala. What's the amygdala supposedly do? You can call it out. Oh, you're a little more sophisticated. I needed somebody to just say fear, right? If you read a lot in the popular press, what you generally hear is, oh, the amygdala is the fear center of the brain. Well, that's an oversimplification. Your amygdala actually does many, many things. It's actually made up of 23 different structures. So it's not just like this fear button that goes off like a smoke alarm when something bad happens. One of the interesting things the amygdala does is that it tags our experiences. It's like, that's a little sticky note. Now, this is not an amygdala, this is a dog, but I wanted you to remember this. Everything you experience gets a little tag. Was it positive? Was it negative? And every time you pull up that information from memory, you're going to pay attention to that tag. We can illustrate this if you think about a bad breakup that you had. Okay, don't get traumatized, but just think back to a time when you had what you thought was a good relationship and then all of a sudden it went sour. Before the breakup, you could pull up many happy memories, right? Walks in the park, kissing at the movie theater. But then after the breakup, what are those memories like? Your brain is going exactly. No, the brain is going to re-tag, reconstruct all of those memories. Now they are not positive memories, they are negative memories because they're associated with something bad that happened. So for our kids, again, we have to pay attention. What tag are they sticking on their emotional experiences? Kathy Patterson here at McLean talks about how they like to rescue wounded ducks. The wounded ducks are the kids who had bad experiences at other schools. Those kids are coming in with many emotional tags telling them that what's going to happen at school is going to be bad and embarrassing and terrible. Our brains literally reward problem solving. We think about our brains as working for rewards, but that's not really true. I could take Miss McCracken Harness right here, and I could walk up to her and give her $50. And the first time I do it, she's going to be really happy and excited. She's like, yeah, I'm going to go to DSW Shoe Warehouse afterwards. It's going to be great. But let's say I started doing that every hour. Here, Kathy, have $50. Here, Kathy, Miss McCracken, have $50. After a while, her brain's not even going to respond to that. There will be no nice dopamine squirt in response to that. The only thing she will notice is if I walk up to her and say, here's $49. Then her brain's going to pay a lot of attention to that, right? The only thing that's going to get a rise out of her is a just noticeable difference, either getting less or if I walk up to her and give her $60. Now her brain's like, ooh, that's nice, good, I'll pay attention to that. But this is why sticker charts don't work. This is why a lot of our behavior plans don't work. They work for the kids who don't need them. They don't generally work for our kids. Why? Because they're not getting motivated by these stickers. What our kids need is to be tapped into what we call the brain's seeking system. The seeking system in your brain is a series of structures connected together in circuits that make it exciting to solve problems. All the zoo animals now are on Prozac. Why? Because they're so depressed. They don't get to solve problems on a routine basis. Our kids are a lot like those animals at the zoo, right? Just pacing back and forth, because they got nothing exciting for them. Everything we do with our kids, we should find a way to have it be meaningful to them, to engage that seeking system. This is fairly obvious. Inhibition is very important when you live with other people. We have to be able to inhibit most of the urges that we have. I'm sure we have a lot of urges right now that we are saying no to, and that's a good thing. That helps us in service of our goal. One of the problems I often see in kids that I work with is that their prefrontal cortex doesn't tell them to put the brakes on. And so they do stuff like walk up to people and go, like, are you losing your hair? Or, I had one, I'll share this with you so that I embarrass myself. I had one little girl I was working with, and she comes up and she says, Miss Rebecca, your bottom is so round. Like, well, yeah. It's middle age, honey. It's going to happen to you too. In general, we got to be able to put the brakes on there. Okay, now we're getting the good stuff. We have to be able to solve problems. And most of the problems that we're interested in talking about today are the problems that our kids are having in school. This is my youngest, by the way. We can teach all of these. It's not like we can teach them all to be amazing and everybody all the time, but we can teach kids to become more strategic and more mindful about how they use their executive functions. One of the problems we often have as adults is overcoming what's called the curse of knowledge. I stole this from Steven Pinker. I didn't come up with it. The curse of knowledge occurs when we lose sight of how hard it is to do something because, again, when we have something that we've mastered, we're not using our right cortex, we're using our left cortex. We don't think about it consciously anymore, right? And so the better you get at something, and they've actually studied this in research studies, the better you get at something, the easier you think it was to learn. And the less patience you have with people who are trying to learn it for the first time. We also lose perspective as to how you actually do it. Try sometime when you're in the middle of a staircase, start thinking about how to go up the stairs. You'll all of a sudden find yourself kind of like, whoa, you ever had that happen when you're walking up the stairs and all of a sudden you think about where the next step is and you kind of wobble? In sports, we call this choking. Right? When athletes all of a sudden start thinking too much about what they're doing, the automatic processes stop, the frontal lobe starts going, and that screws up the whole thing. They want to be totally automatic. For our kids, a lot of times, just as the keynote presenter was talking about today, we forget how hard it was to learn something. We forget all of the